All right, everyone, welcome to the second in the Oral Revolution East Bay Justice Town Hall series. This one is the Education Justice series, and I want to welcome everyone today and everyone here. Special thanks for everyone that's coming and going to watch on the live stream. A quick note for everyone watching on live stream, we're going to be taking questions later. And if you leave your comments in the Facebook or YouTube chat, we will get them and ask them on the live stream. So let's start with the Our Revolution East Bay Justice Town Hall series, where we examine justice from every angle. So what does that mean exactly? Well, exactly what it sounds like. We examine justice from every angle: criminal justice, education justice, environmental justice, housing justice, and on and on. And last time we had the criminal justice series with the history track. So the reason we have the different tracks and the different and the history track is actually pretty simple. From an engineering standpoint, it's extremely difficult to solve a problem if you have no idea how you got the problem. So we need to uncover the history of how we got here and maybe even the misinformation that's getting us here. So that's what we're going to be covering today. Our Revolution East Bay was founded in the wake of the Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign to continue its work with leadership from Nina Turner, Jim Hightower, Larry Cohen, Ben Jealous, James Ogby, and many, many other notable progressives. Last cycle, we won 25 out of our 34 races endorsed locally, and we won 70% of our endorsed races nationally. We are the only truly national grassroots progressive organization fighting at every level of government. And we invite all of you to join us at ourrevolutioneastbay.org. This education series is going to be co-sponsored with the Badass Teachers Association. And I'm going to hand it over to my co-host, Melissa, to talk about the BATS.
Thanks a lot, Jake. And I want to thank you very much for asking us to co-sponsor this event with you. The grassroots movement in itself is very important because that's when you can really stay true to your own voice, such as BATS has over the years. But also, I am a member of Our Revolution out here in New Jersey for Atlantic County. So I was really excited to get invited to do this event. Let me tell you just a little bit about BATS. I won't talk too long because I'm not the one you came to see tonight. We were first started as just a Facebook group way back in June 2013, and in 2016 we became an actual nonprofit. But in the years leading up to where we are today, we did a lot of kind of putting pressure on decision makers around public education. And we did a lot of work to change the narrative of how public education was being viewed. And some of our speakers tonight will go into how it was viewed then and some of the changes that came since we really started advocating for public education, not just us, other organizations as well. Some of the events that we created, hosted, participated in 2014, we did a march on DC, and we had a protest in front of the U.S. Department of Education. We protested Arne Duncan, and we actually made so much noise that we ended up getting asked to come into the Department of Education and have a conversation with him and some of his people because they really couldn't understand why we were so mad at that point in time. In 2015, we recognized that teachers were really, really stressed about not being heard about working conditions. So we created this kind of, started out as an off the cuff, hey, let's do a survey so that teachers could express how they feel. And we ended up with something like 30,000 participants in this survey. Teachers, educators at this point just wanted to be heard. And that has kind of spanned into a lot of work back then with the Department of Education as well as with NIOSH, talking about educator working conditions and what it was like to be an educator. In 2016, we testified at the US DOE around the Every Student Succeeds Act and some of the regulatory changes that they were proposing. Also, that happened to be the same date as the Friedrichs versus CTA Supreme Court case hearing. And we had actually submitted an amicus brief. So we were actually running between the Supreme Court and the Department of Education to make sure that we could get our testimony heard, but also sit and watch this event unfold and on the courtroom floor. After that, we went out to Seattle and we joined with Journey for Justice for an Equity in Education conference. We recognized at that point, being mostly a group of white educators reflective of the education workforce, that we had a lot of work to do around understanding what equity in education was. So we kind of did a more internal conference to work through some of those issues and come up with our platform and mission that we stand by today, with 10 points about what it really means to push for equity in education. And then, of course, came the presidential elections and the election of our previous president. We recognized that federally, a lot of work was not going to be able to be done. And we also realized that in order to make some of the deep-rooted changes that we needed to see, we needed to get local, and we needed to really organize in our communities, our local districts, and our states. So we turned towards kind of strengthening organizing models, making sure that people knew how to create change in their own state and their own areas. And that's what we're coming out of these days. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Melissa. Yeah, thanks to the Bats for co-sponsoring this with us. We couldn't think of a better group to help us, stop the privatization of public education. So let's go ahead and get started with the town hall. So again, this is the first part one in the series of education justice. Today's speakers are Anthony Cody, Dr. Jack Schneider, Dr. Jennifer Berkshire, and Mike Hutchinson. And since we created the town hall series, not only to educate the public, but to educate the public officials, because they are the ones empowered to apply this knowledge immediately and quickly. And so in that vein, we have our Q&A panelists here. We have Ellie Householder from the Antioch School Board, Ben Bartlett from Berkeley City Council, Lamar Thorpe, Antioch Mayor, and Gail McLaughlin, Richmond City Council. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to Melissa, and she can introduce Anthony Cody for us.
I do actually am very honored to be able to introduce Anthony Cody. Anthony was one of the first voices that I listened to when I was learning about the privatization of public education and what had happened in the past. Because originally, as an educator, I was just worried about my own classroom and my own silo. And I began to read a lot of what Anthony had written. I have hung out with him in person, and he's a very honest and truthful voice to listen to. So Anthony has worked for 24 years in the Oakland schools, 18 of them as a science teacher at a high needs middle school. He's a national board certified teacher, and he's now leading workshops with teachers on project-based learning, something I am an immense believer in. He's also the co-founder of the Network for Public Education.
Thank you, Melissa. Thanks very much. Well, I want to talk today about sort of the area that I ended up developing a little bit of expertise in, which was the role of philanthropy in public education, and really a sort of a form of almost predatory philanthropy. Melissa kind of gave you an overview of my a little bit of my history. I just mentioned that I wrote a blog called Living in Dialogue that was on Teacher Magazine at Education Week for about 6 years, and then was independent. It's still up there as livingindialogue.com. I haven't been writing much in the last few years. I helped organize the Save Our Schools March back in 2011, which brought about 7,000 educators to Washington, D.C. To protest the Obama administration's education policy, Race to the Top, and all of that. I had a dialogue with the Gates Foundation back in 2012. That led to the book that The Educator and the Oligarch, which was published a few years after that. And as Melissa mentioned, I helped start the Network for Public Education back in 2013. So one of the things that we discovered as we started, some of us started looking at why, sort of what was going on, what was the source of all of this education reform that started getting, really with No Child Left Behind, especially, we got this whole wave of reform in the early 2000s. And where were the ideas for this coming from? And we discovered that a lot of the initiative was coming from philanthropy. And when you scratch the surface, you discover there's something called strategic philanthropy, which is a way to retain control of large amounts of money and invest it even for profit. And you don't have to pay taxes on it. And you can use that money to shape public policy. You can redirect then much larger amounts of public money, because of course, education is largely publicly funded. And then you're treated as some kind of a hero because of your largesse. And, so it's kind of a win-win-win for somebody like Bill Gates or, a number of these other folks. So we have the Gates Foundation, we have Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, the Broad Foundation, the Walton Family Foundation, Bloomberg, Koch brothers. So all of these, multi-billion-dollar foundations have been directly involved, both in the nonprofit sector and actually also in some of them in funding political candidates that align with their views. And so it's both philanthropy and there's also direct political involvement. These philanthropies fund and sponsor the development of AstroTurf groups that are active, groups like Educators for Excellence, where you have to sign on to agree to support using test scores to evaluate teachers. They sponsor journalism. The Gates Foundation donates to the Education Writers Association. They sponsor journalistic projects, like at the Seattle Times. They were sponsoring something called the Education Lab for a while. They sponsor think tank reports. Some of these organizations, like the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, they will write these pseudo-academic reports that are really advocacy papers that complain about how terrible teacher evaluation systems are because nobody gets fired, or take up various aspects of the education reform cause. They even groups like Teach for America sponsors congressional staff members, so that if you're a member of Congress, they'll give you a free staff member, and it's a direct pipeline into your office, and that person isn't even paid by that congressperson. They're paid by Teach for America, and of course they're delivering their message within the congressional office. They also fund a lot of civil rights groups, donate to a lot of civil rights groups, which might have something to do with why civil rights groups often appear as advocates for high stakes tests. Like right now, we're in this fight over should we still have standardized, should the Department of Education mandate standardized testing at the state level during the midst of a pandemic. And a number of these civil rights groups are coming out in support of that. And it could have something to do with the history of donations, the history of funding that they've received from some of these foundations. I mentioned the dialogue with the Gates Foundation. One of the individuals I was involved with was a former teacher by the name of Irvin Scott. And this was a statement he made to a group of teachers that the Gates Foundation had assembled, where he told them, "We're trying to start a movement started by you, a movement you're leading." And it was just like the perfect encapsulation of sort of this weird dance that they get involved with these AstroTurf efforts, where they sponsor these things and try to prop these groups up and then use them to advocate, since it doesn't sound so great to have the Gates Foundation directly It's much better if they can get some teachers to stand up and say, we want to be evaluated by our test scores. We're sick and tired of our colleagues, not being fired for their bad test scores. One of the things I discovered with, when I was working on all this stuff, trying to make sense of what they were doing, was they really have an ideological belief, almost a religious belief, in the power of the private market to revolutionize industries. And so there's a lot of emphasis on getting rid of the public aspects, the common aspects of the education system, and replacing that with competitive systems. So they want to get rid of elected school boards. They want to get rid of teacher unions. They want these schools to be competing for parents who would choose them. And ultimately, there's been this sort of a weird back and forth over accountability, because tests have been used as sort of a billy club on the schools to prove that the public schools are not working. And the tests is kind of, from somebody like Bill Gates's point of view, in the absence of tests, how do you know how well a school is doing? How do you know well a teacher is doing? How do you know how well students are doing? Well, you have to have some benchmarks, and so you have to create standards, and the more standardized you can make everything, then the more comparable everything can be. Then you can reward those that are doing well, you can punish those that are doing poorly. It also has another ideological effect, which is it kind of creates this illusion of a meritocracy, that our schools are allowing, the best and brightest to rise and be rewarded by their, preparing them to take more tests to get into college, and then college, and so on. And so everything is kind of on this meritocratic system. The problem is that the tests are not accurate measures of accomplishment, and are really rooted in a lot of racist assumptions about how intelligence can be measured. And they divert teachers and the school systems from actually addressing the needs of their students, and instead create this artificial rat race where students and teachers are caught up in trying to prove that they know, that they can regurgitate this canon of Western knowledge. They also, connecting back to the issue of civil rights groups, there's always this promise, well, we need these tests to see where we need to direct additional resources. And this was the justification for No Child Left Behind. It's why Ted Kennedy got on board with it, supposedly, and made this alliance with the Republicans, because the idea was, well, we'll get extra resources for the low scoring schools, and then of course it just was used to prove that those, as evidence that those schools were not adequate. And then we have this sort of bait and switch where we start shifting funds to charters, we start shifting funds to vouchers, and then under DeVos, you actually have a move away from test-based accountability, because they want to now to use those vouchers to fund schools that are actually demonstrably incapable of teaching. When you talk about a lot of the online schools that really do such a miserable job at delivering any sort of educational excellence. So they've sort of, so some of the advocates of choice have shifted away now that, now that the work of discrediting public schools has been accomplished to some extent. They just want to say, well, if parents are choosing it, that by itself is evidence that it's effective, and it's almost a consumer model where if the product is being sold, then we don't really care what, as long as the parent's happy, the kids can be learning that, dinosaurs coexisted with people, that Noah's Ark was how the animals were rescued, et cetera. There's not really a meaningful definition of what real quality learning is. So, we've kind of had a sequence of these experiments. The Gates Foundation was very big on the first two on this list, the Common Core and teacher evaluations based on test scores. We had Eli Broad. His foundation sponsored training of superintendents who then were sent out to districts like Oakland and elsewhere, where they implemented a lot of ideas that were drawn from this outlook. You get things like portfolio districts, which is where you just kind of include all these different charter schools and in your district, and you create this whole marketplace of options for parents. This big expansion of charter schools, vouchers, online learning, and all under this rubric of parental choice. What we're seeing as a result of these experiments and this market-driven ideology is the systematic abandonment of the commons, a return to overt racial and economic segregation in the schools, public funding for religious education, destruction of the teaching profession, and what we're seeing now more and more is a lot of fraud and cronyism and profiteering in the charter school sector. And we mentioned the Network for Public Education. One of the more successful hoaxes that they've pulled off is this idea that charter schools are nonprofits. And a large segment of the charter schools are formally nonprofit, but then they hire a for-profit entity to manage. And so there's a report that the Network for Public Education just put out that talks about this whole hoax and really exposes a lot of the specific instances where this is taking place across the country. And we've been working to try to influence Congress to stop the Congress has been putting $400 million a year into spawning new charter schools across the country. And so we're trying to lobby Congress to halt that, and making some impact, but it's an uphill battle because this has really been quite a tradition for quite a while. So that's kind of what I wanted to share with you, sort of an overview of what philanthropy has been up to over the last 10 or 15 years. And I'll let it pass the mic on to the next speaker.
Great, thanks, Anthony.